The Arizona Territory, a vast, unforgiving canvas, lay baking under a relentless sun. Late afternoon light, thick and golden, stretched long skeletal shadows across the parched ranch land. It was a landscape of stark beauty, broken only by skeletal brush-weathered fence posts, and the distant undulating ridge where the hills seemed to swallow the boundless sky. Silas Blackwood, a man carved from the very rock of this land, stood by his corral. A coil of barbed wire, heavy and unyielding, rested in the crook of one arm, while his other hand gripped a pair of pliers, their hinge rusted into a stubborn grimace. He had been wrestling with the north fence since dawn, a Sisyphean task of slow, deliberate movements. Each step was calculated, each swing of the pliers a testament to enduring patience. His left leg, a constant, unwelcome companion, dragged slightly behind the right, stiffened by a war wound earned in the muddy fields of Tennessee almost 2 decades past. He bore it without complaint. He bore everything without complaint. Silas lived alone on this desolate stretch of earth. 7 years had passed since he'd sought refuge here, a solitary figure, tending his sparse herd of cattle, a few hardy horses, and 2 barn cats he'd never bothered to name. Most days were steeped in a profound silence, a quietude he had come to prefer. After the war, after the devastating fire that had consumed his home, his beloved wife, and the child they had not yet named, he had ceased his search for noise, for solace, for anything beyond the raw, unadorned act of living. He simply rose with the sun, worked until his muscles ached, ate beans from a dented pot, sat by the flickering fire, slept on a cot near the window, and began the cycle anew. When the faint rattle of a wagon reached his ears, Silas didn't stir immediately. He merely paused, the pliers hanging loose in his calloused hand. His head tilted almost imperceptibly towards the distant sound. A light, rhythmic creak of wooden wheels, the dull thud of hooves on dry, compacted earth. He waited, a statue carved from dust and resolve, until the vehicle lumbered into view. It was a single wagon drawn by a lone, weary horse, crawling up the gentle incline towards his property, with an almost insulting lack of urgency, as if its purpose were entirely trivial. Silas recognized the man long before the wagon fully entered the clearing. Marshal Thorne. His shoulders stiffened, a familiar tension settling in his chest. The marshal was a man who seemed perpetually to be smiling at someone else's expense. A broad, self-satisfied grin that rarely reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was built large, with a meticulously waxed gray mustache that seemed utterly out of place in this rugged territory. Thorne wielded considerable power in town, but Silas had always held the town in disdain. He owed them nothing, and they in turn offered him no quarter. It was a simple, unspoken arrangement. Silas slowly set down the pliers, the metallic clink echoing in the vast silence, and waited as the wagon creaked to a halt. Marshal Thorne didn't immediately dismount. He pulled back on the reins, allowing the horse to settle, then leaned one elbow on his thigh, a theatrical gesture of a man preparing to deliver a grand performance. Behind him in the flatbed of the wagon sat a woman. She was upright, shrouded in a thin, light brown wool blanket, her back propped against a wooden crate. Her face was turned away from Silas, her chin tilted slightly towards the distant hills, her eyes in the harsh glare of the setting sun utterly unreadable. Her hair, long and a rich auburn, perhaps chestnut, was tangled at the ends, as if it hadn't known the caress of a brush in a very long time. The dress she wore was a faded beige, worn thin, in places torn at the neckline near the shoulder, loose around her bust, yet clinging at the waist. She made no attempt to conceal herself. Marshal Thorne slapped the reins against his knee. A sharp, percussive sound, and his grin widened, a predatory flash of teeth. "Thought I'd drop by Blackwood," he boomed, his voice unnaturally loud, filling the vast empty space. "Figured you could use some company." Silas offered no reply. The marshal nodded towards the bed of the wagon. "Eleanor, my daughter. You remember her?" Silas's eyes flickered once to the woman, then back to the marshal. He remembered her vaguely from years ago, a fleeting image of a young woman riding side saddle through town, adorned in lace gloves and pristine boots. But that had been before the accident, before she had vanished from public sight, a ghost in her own life. "Horse fell on her," Marshal Thorne stated, his tone dismissive, as if it were a minor inconvenience. "Snapped her back clean. Can't move her legs. Not since she was 22. She's 24 now. Doctors say she won't walk again." Silas didn't ask why he was being told this, why this intimate, devastating detail of a stranger's life was being laid bare before him. The marshal stretched, cracking his neck with a loud pop. "Truth is, she ain't much good to me like this. Costs money. Nurses quit. And hell," he chuckled, a dry, humorless sound, "a man like you could use a woman around. You got no one. She's got no one." Makes sense, don't it? Still, Silas remained silent. He did not look at Eleanor. Not yet. But he could feel her eyes on him now, heavily guarded like a cornered animal waiting for the wrong move. A palpable sense of someone forcing themselves to remain utterly still, to betray no weakness. The marshal finally climbed down from the wagon, his polished boots hitting the dusty ground with an arrogant thud. No obligation, mind you. Just figured I'd do you both a favor. Silas looked at him then, his gaze slow and steady, unwavering. You came all this way to hand me your daughter like livestock. Marshal Thorne's grin didn't falter. She's fed, she's clothed, and she's still got a good face on her. If you're into that. Silas's jaw flexed almost imperceptibly, then relaxed. He took a few steps forward until he reached the side of the wagon. His limp was more pronounced now, his left leg stiff from the knee down, his steps careful, deliberate. He looked at Eleanor directly for the first time. Her skin was pale but not sickly. Her cheekbones were sharp, her mouth full, and her eyes, a startling vivid blue, met his with a complex mixture of pride and silent fury. He saw the tension in her jaw, the way her hands pressed into her lap, white, knuckled, a desperate grip on what little control she had left. You want to be here, Silas? Asked, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. Not for the marshal, but solely for her. Eleanor blinked, a slow, deliberate movement, then nodded once. Not eagerly, but with a profound, quiet resolve. That was enough. Silas turned without a word and walked towards his barn. The marshal's mocking laughter followed him. You really talking Blackwood? Silas ignored him, his focus unwavering. He found a pair of wide cedar planks leaning beside the chicken coop, dragged them across the dirt with slow, steady pulls, and laid them down from the back of the wagon to the cabin's porch steps. When he returned to the wagon, Eleanor was watching him, her hands still gripping the blanket across her legs, her blue eyes fixed on his every move. He said nothing, simply reached forward, one arm sliding behind her back, the other under her knees. She didn't resist. She didn't help either. But when her weight settled against him, he felt how little she weighed, a fragile bundle of bones and spirit. She still possessed a softness, gentle curves, that pressed against his chest, but she was fragile in a way that made his grip instinctively tighten, a primal urge to protect. He carried her up the makeshift ramp, across the porch, and into the sparse, quiet cabin. The interior was plain, almost stark, a cot, a stove, a rough-hewn table, a few shelves. It was clean, meticulously kept, but clearly lived in. She caught a fleeting glimpse of a small folded quilt on the bench by the fire, a rifle hanging above the mantel, a chipped enamel basin on a washstand, a life stripped down to its bare necessary components. He set her gently on the cot and stepped back. She adjusted the blanket herself, maintaining her upright posture, her hands lingering near her chest, subtly pulling the torn neckline closer, though not quite concealing it. He watched her for a second longer, a silent appraisal, then turned and walked back outside. By the time he returned, the marshal's wagon was already vanishing down the hill, a faint plume of dust trailing behind it like a forgotten promise. Silas stood in the yard, staring after it for a long moment, the silence of the ranch settling around him once more. Then he went to the barn, fed the horses, mended a stubborn latch, and worked until the sun dipped low, painting the sky in fiery hues, and the shadows stretched long and distorted across the ground. He did not speak. He did not think about what came next. Inside, Eleanor sat alone on the cot. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the fading light, traced the intricate cracks in the ceiling, the coarse grain in the wooden walls. She could hear movement outside, quiet but steady, the rhythmic sounds of a man working. She took slow, measured breaths, the kind that came when you didn't know if you were truly safe, but suspected for the first time in a very long while that you just might be. She didn't know why he had said yes. She didn't know what he wanted from her, if anything. But he hadn't looked at her legs. He hadn't winced. He hadn't touched her with the casual cruelty or pity that others did. And somehow, in that profound, unsettling quiet that was louder than anything else, the next morning broke with a profound quiet over the hills, the kind of silence that belonged only to places far from roads, far from the clamor of towns. Sunlight slanted across the cabin's wooden floor, illuminating dancing motes of dust in thin, ethereal lines. Silas had been awake for hours, moving around the property with an almost preternatural quiet, feeding the cattle, checking the water pump, stacking the last of the dry wood inside the lean-to, before the relentless heat of the day could climb. His movements were steady, practiced, a meditative rhythm. It was the only way he knew how to think, by doing. Inside the cabin, Eleanor lay still on the cot, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. She hadn't slept much. The mattress was firmer than she was accustomed to, but it wasn't the discomfort that had kept her awake. It was the quiet. A real quiet. Not the kind that preceded a slammed door or the thunder of angry footsteps across a hallway, but the kind that lingered even after her own breath stilled. There were no sharp voices, no creaking floorboards, no men lurking outside her window, pretending not to look inside. Just the soft, persistent whisper of wind through a cracked shutter and the faint, settling creak of old wood. She shifted on the bed as best she could, adjusting her arms beneath her to sit up straighter. The blanket had slipped partway down during the night, once again exposing the torn neckline of her dress. She pulled it up, tucking the ragged shoulder into the seam with a practiced, almost automatic motion. She felt her cheeks flush a little, not from shame, but from the memory of being seen yesterday, truly seen and not by choice. She wasn't used to that kind of looking, not the kind that didn't ask or expect something in return. That man Silas, he hadn't looked at her with hunger or pity, just an unsettling awareness, as if he saw she was there, and that inexplicably was enough. The door creaked open, breaking the spell of the morning. Silas stepped in carrying a tin cup of water and a cracked ceramic plate holding a folded piece of cornbread and a small portion of beans. He set it down on the table near her without speaking, his gaze fixed on the task. She watched him, her blue eyes following his every move. He didn't meet her eyes. "I can feed myself," she said, her voice a little hoarse from disuse. He nodded a brief, almost imperceptible dip of his head and stepped back. She took a breath, then reached for the plate. Her fingers were steady, but her body didn't shift easily without help. She braced herself with one hand on the bed frame and managed to pull the plate onto her lap. The beans were cold, congealed. She ate them anyway, the bland taste a welcome distraction. Silas sat down on the chair by the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee from the tin pot resting on the coals. The room settled back into its profound quiet, broken only by the faint scrape of her spoon against the tin plate and the occasional creak of the floorboards under his weight. "Why'd you take me?" she asked finally, her voice low, almost flat, devoid of accusation, simply seeking understanding. He looked at her for the first time that morning, his gaze steady, unblinking. "You said yes," he said simply, as if that were the entirety of the explanation. "That's not a reason," she countered, a flicker of frustration in her eyes. It was enough. She stared at him a moment longer, trying to read something in his stoic face, but he was hard to decipher. His eyes were always quiet, his jaw always set. He wasn't avoiding her, but he wasn't inviting conversation either. Not a coldness, more like he didn't know what to say, or how to articulate the complex currents beneath his calm exterior. "You don't ask many questions, do you?" She mused, a hint of something akin to curiosity in her tone. He shrugged slightly, a small economical movement. "Only when I need answers." Eleanor nodded to herself. That made more sense than anything she'd heard from a man in years. Still, a part of her, the part that had been repeatedly wounded and discarded, didn't trust it. She had been passed between relatives and caretakers since the accident. Some cruel, some merely careless, most just tired of her burdensome presence. When her father had left her here, she had braced herself for more of the same, perhaps even worse. She had steeled herself for humiliation, for rejection, for cold indifference. Instead, this man had built her a ramp. She looked around the plain room, a sudden desperate question forming in her mind. "Where am I supposed to go?" "There's a shed out back," Silas said, his voice even. "I built a bench inside. I can help you get there." She frowned, a ripple of confusion crossing her face. "So you expected me to stay?" He didn't answer that right away. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze distant. "I don't do charity," he said, his voice low, firm. "If someone's here, they help. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay, you'll have your place. Not as a guest." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of defiance. "And what is this? Some kind of trade you feed me? What, do laundry from a chair? Warm your bed eventually?" The words were laced with a bitter sarcasm, a challenge. Silas's face didn't change, not a flicker of emotion. "I didn't ask for that." She stared at him, waiting for some flicker of motive, some hint of shame, insult, or even desire. But there was nothing, just that unsettling steadiness. It unnerved her more than cruelty would have. "I don't know what to do here," she muttered, her voice barely audible, a confession of profound helplessness. "You'll figure it out," he said, then stood and walked outside, the screen door creaking shut behind him. Alone again, she looked down at her lap. Her hands trembled a little, a fine tremor she couldn't control. She hadn't cried since before the accident, since the world had irrevocably tilted on its axis. She wouldn't now. But she felt something stir deep under her ribs, a fragile, tentative movement she hadn't allowed in for a very long time. possibility. By mid-morning, Silas returned with 2 more planks of wood and a box of nails. She watched through the open doorway as he measured out a section of the porch just beyond the steps. He worked without speaking, sweat beading under the brim of his hat, tracing paths through the dust on his face. He drove nails in with long, precise swings, kneeling slowly, because of his bad leg, adjusting boards by feel more than sight. She wheeled herself forward in the chair he had dragged in from the barn. It wasn't made for comfort, a rough wooden contraption, but it moved, and it was something she could do on her own. She rolled to the edge of the porch and looked down at the ground, watching him work. "You built that for me?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. He didn't stop hammering. "Was going to build one for the coop. You needed it more." She didn't smile, but her throat tightened a little, a sudden constriction of emotion. "I can wash vegetables. Clean beans. If you bring them to me." He nodded without looking up. "Good." Eleanor turned her chair and rolled back inside her hands, trembling slightly on the wheels. Silas finished the ramp and leaned back, assessing the slope with a critical eye. He didn't say it aloud, but her offer to help mattered. Not because he needed it. He had done just fine alone for years, but because it meant she wasn't waiting to be saved. She was willing to fight for her own place. That night they didn't speak much. She peeled potatoes, her movements slow but deliberate. He salted pork, his hands steady and efficient. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks against tin plates and the crackle of the fire. She asked if he'd always lived alone. He said, "Not always," and left it at that, a door firmly closed. As the sky turned dark outside and the oil lamp flickered inside the cabin, casting dancing shadows on the walls, Silas sat by the window, meticulously cleaning his hunting knife. Eleanor sat in the chair by the hearth, her hair down now, a cascade of auburn around her shoulders, her eyes soft with thought, gazing into the flames. She didn't know what tomorrow would be like, but for the first time in 2 years, no one was expecting her to disappear, to fade into the background, and that she realized meant everything. The third morning arrived with a sharp, biting wind and a slate-colored sky that hinted at the turning of the season. Silas had already been outside before first light, checking the fencing along the east pasture where coyotes had been sniffing around, their hungry shadows lurking. When he returned to the cabin, he found Eleanor at the wash basin, a damp cloth in one hand, meticulously wiping down the windowsill from her seated position. The chair he'd built for her was sturdier now, with wider wheels to handle the uneven floorboards and small reinforcements on the arms. He hadn't asked if she wanted it. She hadn't asked why he made it, but she used it, and that was enough for both of them. Eleanor noticed him standing in the doorway and straightened up slightly, a subtle adjustment of her posture. Her hair was brushed back into a loose, elegant knot at the nape of her neck. The tear in her dress near the neckline had been clumsily stitched, with blue thread from the small sewing kit he had placed on a shelf days before. She hadn't said anything when she found it, but she had used it. Her chest still rose and fell beneath the fabric when she breathed, but the dress fit cleaner now, less accidental, more deliberate. "I found a broom," she said simply, her voice soft. "Swept near the hearth. It's not much, but it's something." Silas nodded, removed his hat, and placed it on the peg by the door. "It's enough." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was what passed for conversation between them. Short, simple, honest. Eleanor looked down at the cloth in her hand, then up at him, her blue eyes searching his face. "Why'd you fix the chair?" she asked, a directness that surprised him. He didn't sit, just leaned his hand on the edge of the table, his posture relaxed yet watchful. "You needed to move easier." "I could have asked. You didn't have to." She studied his face, a canvas of weathered lines and quiet strength. No smile, no overt warmth, but no hardness either. Just that quiet stillness he wore like an old comfortable coat. Eleanor's eyes flicked towards his leg, then his left knee, noticing how it didn't fully straighten when he moved. She had seen it, of course, noticed how he favored one side, how stairs took him a second longer. A shared vulnerability. "What happened to your leg?" she asked, her voice gentle, devoid of pity. He hesitated, then answered plainly, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, as if recounting a long-ago distant event. "Gettysburg. Took a round through the knee. Doctor said I'd lose the leg. Didn't, but it's never been the same." She let that settle for a moment, the weight of the words hanging in the air. "You fought for the Union. Didn't care much about sides. Just signed up after they took my brother." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window, to the endless expanse of the land. "And after the war, went home. House had burned. Wife and son inside. I didn't stay long." Her throat tightened, a sudden unexpected constriction. She hadn't expected him to tell her that to lay bare such profound, devastating loss. The way he said it, flat, devoid of emotion, made it feel heavier somehow, like the weight hadn't gone away, just settled too deep to rise anymore. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, a slight inclination of his head. "You don't have to be." Later that day, Silas hitched up the buckboard and told her he'd be gone for most of the afternoon. Supplies. Flour, salt, maybe nails. She didn't ask if she could come. She knew better. Getting her in and out of that wagon would be near impossible without building something custom, and he wasn't the kind of man to ask someone like her to be stared at in town. Not if it could be helped. After he left, Eleanor wheeled herself to the back window and looked out across the vast empty land. Dust blew up in small, restless spirals around the yard. The horizon looked endless, a stark line between earth and sky. She still didn't know what this place was supposed to be for her. Not a home, not yet. But it wasn't a cage, and that alone made it profoundly different. Inside, she started sorting. The shelves were cluttered with loose tinware, empty jars, mismatched socks. She pulled a small wooden crate to the edge of the table and began placing things into categories, a quiet act of imposing order on chaos. Order helped. It made her feel like the ground wasn't shifting beneath her all the time. While wiping the counter, her hand brushed against something that had been pushed to the far end. A stack of folded cloth. She unfolded one and found a dress not new but carefully sewn. Soft cotton, a deep muted dark green, a bit large at the waist. The sleeves, when unrolled, were long. A woman's dress. It had clearly belonged to someone else. She set it down slowly, her fingers tracing the fabric. Was it his wife's? There were no photographs around, no keepsakes. Just that dress folded carefully and kept out of sight, a silent testament to a life that once was. When Silas returned, dusk had already crawled over the hills, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. He carried 2 heavy sacks, one of flour, one of salt, and set them by the stove without a word. Eleanor didn't ask about the town, didn't ask who had seen him, if they'd said anything about her. But he volunteered something as he poured water into the kettle, his voice low, almost an afterthought. Thorne was at the store. She looked up sharply, her chest tightening with a familiar dread. What did he say? Tried to laugh. Asked how the girl was adjusting. Said I'd regret it. Her jaw clenched, a muscle working in her cheek. And what did you say? I didn't. She lowered her gaze, her voice barely audible. He thinks I'm some punishment. Something you're supposed to grow tired of. Silas stirred the kettle with the edge of a spoon, the metallic sound sharp in the quiet room. Then he said quietly, his voice firm, "He don't know much." That night, Eleanor changed into the green dress. It was loose in the middle, but the bodice hugged her just right, and the muted color made her skin look less pale, almost luminous in the lamplight. When she wheeled herself into the kitchen, Silas glanced at her, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second, then back to the fire. No overt reaction, but she saw something shift in his broad shoulders. A subtle release of tension, then something else. Something like stillness, finding comfort in her presence. "Your wife's?" she asked, her voice soft. He shook his head once. No, belonged to her sister. She stayed here a while after the fire before she moved east. She nodded slowly, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I'll fix the waste if you don't mind me keeping it. It's yours." They ate dinner in silence, but it wasn't heavy or oppressive. Just quiet. She had peeled potatoes again, and he'd salted some fresh meat from a rabbit he'd snared earlier. Afterward, he washed the plates, his hands large and capable, and she dried them, her fingers surprisingly nimble. Before bed, as Silas moved to place more wood in the fire, Eleanor's voice stopped him, a soft, hesitant question. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" He paused, the log still in his hands, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Used to." He paused again, then added, his voice low. "And now there's someone else here." She didn't say anything, just looked at him, her blue eyes wide and unblinking. The fire popped in the hearth, throwing orange light across his rugged face. He looked tired, weathered, a man who had seen too much but alive in a way she hadn't seen that first day. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either, a silent acknowledgement of the fragile connection forming between them. Morning came gray and quiet, with a light mist hanging over the ranch, the kind that made the wooden boards of the porch sweat, and the horses restless in the barn. Eleanor stirred earlier than usual. Her body ached from the waist-up muscles she hadn't used in years, slowly beginning to wake, protesting their newfound activity. She didn't complain. She pushed herself upright in the bed, adjusted the green dress now cinched at the waist with a makeshift belt she had sewn from an old saddle strap, and wheeled herself towards the stove, where the cold ashes from last night still gave off a faint warmth. She moved with a quiet purpose now, her hands sure and steady. There was still a slight slowness in her shoulders, the ingrained instinct of someone expecting to be interrupted or watched too closely. But Silas never hovered, never corrected her, never touched without asking. He came in a little after sunup, his coat damp from the fog, carrying a wooden bucket full of freshly gathered eggs. Eleanor reached for a pan and set it on the stove before he could. A small, independent gesture. He paused just for a second, watching her, then set the bucket down without a word, and stepped back. "Rain's coming," he said, his voice a low rumble. She nodded. "I could feel it in my arms last night. They get tight." "You hurting?" "Not bad, just stiff." He poured himself a cup of coffee. She cracked 3 eggs into the pan, the yolks a vibrant orange. Silas leaned against the doorframe, silent for a while, sipping his coffee. Then he said, his voice flat, "Town will talk about you soon." Eleanor didn't stop what she was doing, her hands moving with practiced ease. "They've always talked. Not like this. You being here with me." She slid the pan slightly to keep it from burning, a small deliberate movement. "Let them talk." His eyes rested on her a moment longer, a silent assessment. Then he nodded once, a gesture of acceptance. After breakfast, Silas spent most of the day reinforcing the roof over the barn, preparing for the coming storm. Eleanor stayed inside, sorting through what supplies they had, meticulously labeling jars, organizing beans and dried corn, sharpening the old kitchen knife on a flat stone, the way she'd seen her aunt do when she was a child. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need it anymore. That afternoon, the clouds finally opened. Rain fell hard, sudden and loud on the tin roof, a drumming symphony that filled the cabin. Eleanor wheeled herself to the door and watched it come down in thick, relentless sheets, drenching the parched land. Out in the field, she could just barely see Silas walking back towards the cabin, his coat soaked through his limp, more pronounced now with the mud sucking at his boots. When he stepped onto the porch, she had already laid a dry cloth over the chair by the door and a towel on the table. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "I ain't helpless," she said, a hint of challenge in her voice. "Didn't say you were." She reached for the towel and handed it to him. As he took it, their fingers touched a brief, warm, steady contact. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering, and didn't pull away right away. "I'll heat up the stew," she said, her voice softer now. He didn't stop her. That evening they ate beside the fire, the rain still drumming relentlessly on the roof. The room smelled of wood smoke and meat, a comforting aroma, and the only sounds were the steady patter of rain and the occasional crack from the hearth. After dinner, she folded the towels, wiped down the table, and poured them each a cup of coffee. Silas didn't talk much, but that night he said something unexpected, a rare glimpse into his thoughts. "You always this stubborn?" Eleanor sipped her coffee slowly, considering his question. "I had to be. My father didn't care much for daughters who ask questions. After the accident, he treated me like I'd already died. Like I embarrassed him just by breathing." Silas didn't flinch, just nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on the fire. "He's a coward." She glanced at him, surprised by the blunt assessment. "He's a marshal, still a coward." The firelight flickered across the room, painting their faces in shifting hues of orange and shadow. Eleanor shifted in her chair, her voice low, hesitant. "You didn't ask what happened that day. When the horse threw me, I figured you'd tell me if it mattered. It wasn't just the fall. I was running. There was someone my father didn't approve of. I'd been meeting him in secret, he found out. We argued. I ran. Horse bucked. My spine cracked on a rock." Silas took that in without blinking, his expression unreadable. "Man you were meeting. He leave." Eleanor's mouth flattened a bitter line. "He never came to the house. Never visited the hospital. Never wrote. My father said that's what you get for crawling into the arms of weak men." Silas's jaw tightened, a slow, hard clench. "He's wrong." She watched him, her blue eyes searching his. "You think I'm broken?" "No," he said without hesitation, his voice firm, resolute. "Just tired. Like me." She lowered her eyes, a profound weariness settling in her chest. "Sometimes I don't know what I'm still fighting for." "For yourself, Silas," said his voice, gentle but unwavering. "That's enough." Later, as she was preparing for bed, he stopped near the door, not quite ready to leave the room. "I can build you something better. A bench, something you can use out there for planting if you want." She looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "You think I'm staying? You haven't rolled away yet." Eleanor let out a breath. She hadn't realized she'd been holding a soft, shaky exhale. then a quiet, almost desperate affirmation. Then yes, I want it. And then without planning it, without thinking too long, she reached for his hand, not to pull him closer, just to touch, to say she was still here, that she was choosing to stay. Silas didn't pull away. He let her fingers wrap around his large and calloused, yet gentle, and for a moment there was no marshal, no accident, no crushing weight of the past, just two people who hadn't run. The rain cleared overnight, leaving the air clean and crisp, the ground slick with fresh mud. By sunrise, the sun had broken through, pouring golden light over the land, warming the porch slats. A few sparrows pecked at puddles near the corral, their chirps a cheerful counterpoint to the quiet morning. Inside the cabin, Eleanor sat by the open window, a tin mug of warm water in her hands, listening to the stillness. Her fingers traced the rim slowly, a meditative gesture. She was dressed in the green cotton dress again, now properly fitted at the waist, a testament to her own quiet efforts. Her hair was pinned back, simply not for anyone, just to feel neat, clean, like she belonged in her own skin again. Silas was already outside, the faint rhythmic sound of his hammering echoing across the yard as he drove in fence stakes on the north side where the recent rain had loosened the posts. Eleanor could hear the sharp rhythm of each blow, consistent, steady. She had started to learn his routines, the silent language of his days. He didn't talk when he worked, didn't hum, didn't mutter. He just did. And somehow that helped her breathe easier, a silent reassurance. By late morning, Silas came back into the cabin, his arms streaked with dirt, a faint line of sweat beneath the collar of his shirt. He washed up at the basin, then looked over at her. "You've been out yet today?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head. "Thought I'd wait till the mud dried some. My wheels don't like getting stuck." He gave one small nod and grabbed a rag to dry his face. Then he hesitated, a rare moment of uncertainty. "I built the bench out past the coop." Eleanor's brow lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise. That was fast. "Didn't sleep much." She didn't ask why. She just rolled herself towards the door, a quiet urgency in her movements, and he followed her down the ramp. The morning sun hit her legs as she rolled, warming the fabric of her dress, a sensation she hadn't truly felt in years. Her hands gripped the wheels, firmly guiding herself down onto the dirt path. Out past the chicken coop, set against the fence line near a patch of open ground, was a wooden bench, low, sturdy, with a flat surface long enough to hold tools or baskets. A half-built planting box sat beside it, waiting for life. She wheeled closer and rested her hand on the smooth new wood, a profound sense of wonder filling her. "You did this last night?" He nodded. She looked at him, her blue eyes searching his. "Why?" He met her eyes without hesitation, his gaze steady and direct. "You said you wanted to stay. I figured that meant you wanted to work." Her chest tightened at the words, a sudden rush of emotion. She turned her attention to the planting box, her voice soft, filled with a nascent hope. "We could do herbs here. Maybe onions come spring." Silas crouched beside the box, testing one of the corners with his hand. "We can start clearing this side tomorrow." She smiled just faintly, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "It's been a long time since anyone let me build something. Now you can." They stayed outside most of the day. Eleanor practiced moving her chair over the uneven ground, gaining confidence with each bump and rut. Silas hauled in extra planks, letting her sort through them and choose what to keep, a quiet act of shared purpose. At one point, when she reached too far and tipped the chair slightly, he was at her side instantly, his hand steadying the armrest, his other at her back, a solid, reassuring presence. "I've got it," she muttered, a flash of her old pride. "I know," he said, but he didn't let go until she was righted steady on her wheels once more. That evening, they returned to the cabin just before sundown. Silas brought in kindling while Eleanor wiped down the table, their movements synchronized, a quiet domestic ballet. They ate supper slowly, savoring the simple meal. She asked about the ridge east of the property, and he told her it led to the creek about 2 miles out. "Ever fish?" he asked, a rare question from him. "I used to with my cousin before the accident." "We'll go sometime," he said, as if it were already settled, a promise hanging in the air. After they finished eating, she rolled towards the fire, setting her mug on the floor beside her. Silas sat across from her, working a leather strap through a rusted buckle, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You never told me why you left town for good," she said, her voice soft, curious. He didn't look up, his fingers still busy with the buckle. "After the fire, there wasn't anything left there." Folks stared. They meant well, but they stared. She nodded, a profound understanding in her eyes. "I know that stare." He glanced at her then, and something in his face softened just enough to make the silence feel warmer than any words. "You think folks will come looking for me again?" she asked, a tremor of old fear in her voice. Silas considered it, his gaze distant. Maybe, but not right away. Thorne's pride won't let him admit he gave you up. Not unless he's drunk or angry. He's both most nights. Eli didn't respond. Clara leaned forward slightly. You don't want to ask what it was like in town in that house. I figured if you ever needed to say it, you would. She took a breath. He made me stay upstairs most days. Didn't want anyone seeing me in a chair. Said it made him look weak. Once he told me to wear a shawl to hide my arms. Said I looked sick. One night when he was drunk, he told me he wished I died when I fell. Eli's jaw clenched slow and hard. He said I'd ruined his name, she added, as if I did it on purpose. He looked at her, truly looked, and said, "That man doesn't know the first thing about you." Her voice was quieter then. I used to wonder if anyone ever would. I do, Eli said steady and without hesitation. The room was still. The fire cracked once in the hearth. She reached for her mug again, but her fingers hesitated. Instead, she placed him flat on her lap and looked across at him. Would you help me with something, she asked. What is it? I want to sit beside you. On the floor, not in this chair. He paused, then stood slowly and walked over. Carefully, he knelt beside her, slid one arm under her knees, the other behind her shoulders. She braced herself as he lifted her arms, circling his neck, not out of need, but for balance. He lowered her onto a blanket she had laid out earlier right in front of the fire. She leaned into him, just slightly steadying herself. Her side pressed against his for a moment longer than needed. He didn't move away. I don't want to be looked at like I'm broken anymore, she whispered. You're not. He turned to look at her. Her face was soft in the firelight, the tear in the corner of her. I didn't fall. He reached up slow and careful and brushed her hair back behind her ear. Then he leaned in steady and unhurried and kissed her once firm, warm, honest. She let herself kiss him back. They didn't speak after that. They just sat there side by side on the floor, letting the heat of the fire and each other do the rest. The next morning, the cabin was quiet in a different way. Not silent like before, not weighed down with uncertainty or distance, but still settled. The kind of quiet that came after something unspoken had shifted between two people. Something real. Eli woke early, as he always did. He stood at the edge of the bedroom where he'd slept on the floor again, not far from the fireplace. Claire was still sleeping on the cot. He had carried her back there after she nodded off beside the fire the night before. Her weight had surprised him again, not for its lightness, but for how natural it felt to hold her like she fit there in his arms. No part of it had felt strange. Now, with her breathing slow and her face turned toward the window light, he watched her for a moment longer than usual. Then he stepped outside into the cold morning. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and bacon. The cabin was warmer than usual, the stove already going, a pan set up for breakfast. She sat up slowly, adjusting the straps of her dress, which had slipped slightly off one shoulder in the night. She fixed it with a quiet hand, then reached for the small mirror above the washstand. Her hair was tangled at the ends, her eyes heavy with sleep, but her face looked different now, less guarded, more sure. When Eli stepped back in, she was already at the table, pulling her chair close. You sleep all right? He asked. She nodded. Better than most nights. My back wasn't as tight. You said you used to sew. That's still true. She looked up curious. Yes, what? Found a roll of canvas in the barn. Thought maybe you could help make some new saddle covers. Mine re-tearing. I can do that. They ate together in silence, but a different kind of silence now. One that held comfort. Later that day, Clara worked at the table, stretching canvas marking patterns with a bit of chalk Eli had carved. The wind outside had picked up and the sky turned a dry yellow-gray. A storm was likely coming again, but for now the weather held. As she worked, she asked Eli, you said your wife died in the fire. Did you ever talk to her folks after that? He paused from splitting kindling near the stove. Once her brother rode out here, blamed me for not being there. I was in Tucson looking for fencing wire. Fire started from the hearth. Chimney flue was cracked. No one knew. Clara lowered her hands. And your son barely too. They were both asleep. She didn't say anything after that. She didn't need to. She just looked at him, saw the weight in his shoulders, and let him finish without interruption. He didn't like pity. She understood that now. After that, I didn't talk to anyone for almost a year, he said. Just worked. Fixed things that didn't need fixing. Saturday at the table with no food on it. And now I talk to you. She smiled faintly and reached out to touch his hand on the table. He let her. That afternoon, a rider came down the trail. Clara saw him first through the window and felt her chest tighten. A young man, maybe 20, wearing a town deputy badge and riding a lean sorrel horse. Eli stepped out before the man dismounted. "You Decker?" the deputy asked. Eli nodded. "Sheriff Mercer sent a message. Said he wants the girl returned by week's end. Says he was generous, but it's time she comes home." Eli's eyes didn't change. "She's not going back. She's his daughter. She's a grown woman." The deputy looked uncomfortable. "I'm just passing the message." "You did." Without another word, the young man turned the horse around and rode off. When Eli stepped back inside, Clara was sitting stiffly in the chair by the table. "So he want me back," she said. "He doesn't get a say. I figured he'd come eventually." Eli looked at her. "You scared?" "Not of him," she said. "I'm scared of being taken away from you. From this quiet, you're not going anywhere." She looked at him closely. "You believe that?" Yes, that night she sat by the fire again, closer to him now. The distance between them had shortened in every sense. She leaned against him without hesitation, her shoulder pressed to his, her hand resting near his knee. He turned his head slightly and spoke low. "I haven't been with a woman since before the fire. I haven't been with a man since before the fall." He looked at her, then really looked. Her hand moved to his chest. Slow, deliberate. Her eyes didn't leave his. "Do you want me?" she asked. "Yes," he said, quiet but sure. "Then touch me." Eli leaned in steady and controlled and kissed her deeper this time. No hesitation. His hands cupped her face thumbs, brushing her cheekbones. She pulled him closer, arms sliding over his shoulders, anchoring herself to him like she'd waited years to feel this solid. His mouth moved to her neck, to her collarbone, fingers tracing the edge of her neckline, then resting against the skin where her dress had torn days ago. Clara let her breath deepen. Her body had limits, but her desire didn't. He lifted her again, slow and firm, and laid her down gently on the cot. The lamplight flickered across the room. She guided his hand to her waist, and his touch was careful, reverent. They undressed without speaking, slowly letting every movement be known, deliberate. When he touched her, truly touched her, he did so like she wasn't broken. And when she held him like he hadn't already been taken from once before. They stayed that way well into the night, wrapped in shared breath and silence. No promises spoken, no fears voiced, just presence, just the quiet, solid act of staying. The morning after was still windless. The air held the faint smell of burned cedar from the fireplace, and the weight of something that had shifted but didn't need explaining. Eli stirred first, sitting on the edge of the cot in the dim gray light filtering through the window. He looked down at Clara, still wrapped in the quilt, her hair loose over one shoulder, her breathing even. Her dress was folded neatly on the chair beside the bed. He had never known quiet to feel this full. He stood, got dressed slowly, then stepped outside. The sky was low with cloud cover, but the light had that clear, open quality that came after days of rain. A few sparrows perched along the corral post, chirping softly. Inside, Clara woke to the sound of the screen door easing shut. She stretched her arms, adjusted the blanket over her chest, and sat up as best she could. Her body was sore, but not from pain. More like her muscles had remembered something they thought was gone. She dressed and brushed out her hair with the small ivory handle brush she'd found in the bottom drawer days ago. She caught her reflection in the cracked mirror. There was a softness in her eyes she hadn't seen in years. She didn't look like someone passing through anymore. She looked rooted. Eli returned as she was fixing the collar of her dress. "Coffee's hot," he said. She nodded. "I'll bring the cups." They moved in quiet rhythm. Two people who now shared something unspoken but steady. Over breakfast, they didn't talk about the night. They didn't need to. Later that morning, Clara worked in the garden bed while Eli sawed wood for a new gate panel. The garden wasn't much yet, just a patch of cleared earth with some row markers she'd laid out using sticks and twine, but it was hers. She braced her body across the bench he'd built and dug with a trowel, slow but determined. Her arms ached, but she didn't stop. At midday, Eli brought her water and sat beside her in the dirt. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and glanced over at the fence line. "He'll come himself next time," he said. She didn't ask who. She knew. "I'm not going with him," she said, calm and sure. "I know, but if he rides out here angry, he won't come alone." Clara wiped her palms on a rag. "You'd fight him." "I'd protect what's mine." She looked at him. "Is that what I am?" He turned to her. "If you want to be," she didn't answer with words. Just reached over, rested her hand on his. By dusk, the clouds had thickened and wind began to push in from the west. Eli secured the barn doors while Clara finished drying the wash. As she hung a final cloth on the line, she noticed movement in the distance, 2 riders coming slow down the trail. She narrowed her eyes, heart tightening. Eli, she called out, her voice low but urgent. He stepped around the barn, rifle already in hand. The 2 riders came into full view, Sheriff Mercer and one of his deputies. Clara recognized the wide shoulders and clean, smug shape of her father's posture even from a distance. They stopped 20 paces from the house. "Thought I'd find you still here," Mercer called. Eli stood between the house and Clara, his stance wide. "You were told." Mercer dismounted, boots crunching dry grass. "That's my daughter. I didn't give you leave to keep her." "She's not property," Eli said flatly. "She's under my name. Under my roof until I say otherwise. Not anymore." Clara wheeled forward then, placing herself in line with Eli, her eyes locked on her father's. "You made that clear when you left me here like a sack of wheat," she said. His face hardened. "I was trying to give you a chance. No, you're getting rid of something you didn't know how to deal with." He stepped forward. "You don't understand. I understand enough. I know you were embarrassed by me. I know you couldn't stand that I didn't walk or smile on cue or make you look good in town. You're confused." Mercer snapped. "This man's using you." Eli didn't move. His rifle was still at his side, steady, not raised. "I've never used her," he said. "I listened. I stayed." Mercer looked at Clara. "You're coming home." His jaw clenched. "You'll regret this. I've already lived through worse." The deputy shifted uncomfortably on his saddle. "Sheriff, enough," Mercer muttered. He looked at Eli, and for a moment his face shifted, not in a softness, but into realization. He wasn't going to win this one. "You'll hear from me again," he said, stepping back to his horse. "You do that," Eli said. They rode off without another word. Clara let out a breath, her hands trembling slightly. "You all right?" Eli asked. She nodded. "Just tired of ghosts." Eli reached for her hand again. "You're safe here." She looked at him, and this time she smiled. Not polite, not forced, real. The days that followed settled into a rhythm again, but it was different now. Firmer, more certain. Mercer hadn't returned, and the deputy hadn't ridden back up the trail either. Still, Eli kept his rifle oiled and within arm's reach. He didn't say it out loud, but Clara could see it in how often he glanced at the horizon, how he moved with more caution when he walked the fence line. She didn't question it. She understood what it meant for a man like him to live, always expecting something to be taken from him. Clara didn't sit idle. Each morning she wheeled out to the garden bench and picked up where she'd left off. The soil was slowly giving way under her hands, and she was learning the lay of it. What parts stayed wetter, where the wind hit hardest, where the morning sun was strongest. Eli had shown her how to check the dirt for moisture, how to press seeds in without burying them too deep. She wasn't just tending something. She was building something that might stay. One evening, while she worked the rows, Eli joined her with 2 tin mugs of cooled coffee. He handed her one, then sat beside her on the bench. "You planning on planting all of Arizona?" he asked. She smiled slightly. "Just enough so we don't have to eat dried beans every night." "That bad, huh? I've had worse." They sat in silence, sipping coffee, watching the wind move through the hills. Clara shifted slightly, her fingers tracing the handle of the mug. "Do you think I'll ever be more than this? I mean, more than just the body in a chair?" Eli looked at her. "You already are." She met his eyes. "You say that like it's simple." "It is." He said, "You want to stay alive. You work. You care about things. That's more than most folks ever do." Her throat tightened a little. "You've never asked if I wanted to leave. You would have said so if you did." "I don't. I know." He reached over and rested his hand over hers. "But if you ever do, I won't stop you. I'd take you to town myself. Find you a better place. Make sure you had what you needed. I already have what I need." She said, steady now. "You stayed. No one else ever did that." That night she bathed by firelight. Eli carried the water and poured it gently into the basin near the hearth. He didn't watch her undress. He didn't have to. She let her dress fall from her shoulders, her body marked by time and healing, but she didn't cover herself when he returned with a clean cloth. She looked at him as she was, and he met her with the same stillness he always had. Afterward, she rolled in a bed beside him, not on the cot anymore, but on the larger frame. They'd moved into the corner of the room after Eli built it with his own hands. They lay together under a shared blanket. Her head rested against his chest. His hand ran gently over her hip down the curve of her waist. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her mouth, slow but firm, lingering like he knew exactly what he wanted and had finally allowed himself to want it. Her body responded to his without fear. She guided his touch. He let her lead. When he entered her, she gasped softly, not from pain, but from how carefully he moved, how holy he was with her. They didn't speak through it. They didn't need to. The room was full of breath and warmth, and the creak of the bed, and the ache of lies that had been live alone for too long. After she curled into him and he wrapped both arms around her like a man holding something he didn't plan to let go of. "You still afraid he'll come back?" she whispered. "No," Eli said, "because if he does, he won't find the same woman." She rested her chin on his chest and looked up at him. "I don't want to be your burden. You're not. I don't want to be your obligation either. You're not that either. Then what am I?" He touched her face, thumb brushing just under her eye. "You're mine and I'm yours. That's all." The oil lamp flickered low. She smiled for the second time that day. A real smile. Not because someone told her to. Not because she owed it, but because she felt it. They fell asleep like that. Wrapped in each other, the room quiet, the garden dark, outside the land holding its breath. They didn't know it yet, but the final test was coming and they were ready. The sun rose hard and clear the next morning, pouring gold over the dry earth like it was trying to burn away whatever shadows had lingered overnight. Eli was already outside before first light, checking the perimeter again. He hadn't said it out loud, but Clara could feel it. Something had shifted in him since Mercer's visit. He moved with more purpose now, not frantic, not scared, but alert, like a man who'd been marked and was waiting for it to happen again. Inside, Clara sat at the table, threading the last buttons onto a canvas sack. Her movements were steady, arms stronger now, shoulders more defined. Her hair was tied back in a firm knot, face clean clearied. The woman who had first arrived, slumped in a wagon bed, no longer existed, and she knew it. When Eli came through the door, his jaw was tight. "Riders," he said, her chest tensed. "How many?" "3. Coming slow, but they're armed. Mercer's horse is in front." Clara didn't flinch. "What do you want me to do?" "Stay inside. Lock the door. If anything happens." "No," she said. "I'm not hiding." Eli looked at her long. "This isn't pride. This is danger. And I'm not some fragile thing you have to tuck under a blanket anymore." They held each other's gaze. Finally, he nodded once, then, "Stay behind me. Don't move unless I say." By the time the riders reached the yard, Eli was already waiting on the porch, rifle leaning against the post, but his hands free. Clara wheeled herself just behind him, half in the shadow of the doorway. Mercer climbed down from his horse like he was dismounting for a parade. He wore his badge pinned proud and bright, but his face was tight with anger. "I told you I'd be back," he said. "And I told you she wasn't going anywhere," Eli replied. Mercer's eyes darted toward Clara. "She's not in her right mind. She's been manipulated." "I'm right here," Clara said, her voice calm but sharp. "If you got something to say about me, say it to me." Mercer turned fully toward her, surprised by the steel in her tone. "You think he loves you? You think this is anything but pity? Look at you." "I did," she said. "Every day for months. And for the first time I like what I see." Mercer's mouth twitched. "I have legal standing." "No, you don't." Eli said, "She's of age. She's not under your roof. She stays because she chooses to. You don't get to keep her just because you dragged her into your bed." "You gave her up," Eli said. "I didn't force a thing. You did that the day you loaded her in that wagon and left her in my door like a stray animal." Mercer reached for his holster. Just a touch. Eli stepped forward, voice steady. "Don't. You know I'm faster." The moment stretched. Clara didn't blink. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Father. And you're not ashamed of me. You're ashamed of yourself, of how you treated me when I needed you most." The deputy beside Mercer, same young man from before, looked between the two, then slowly stepped his horse back a pace. He didn't want a part in what was about to happen. Mercer's fingers twitched. Eli's hand dropped to the rifle, but he didn't raise it yet. Mercer looked at Clara one last time, and something in his face cracked. Maybe pride, maybe control. He saw that he'd already lost. Not just the argument, her. She wasn't coming back. He spit into the dirt, bitter, then turned back toward his horse. "You stay out here and rot with him if that's what you want. Just don't expect anyone to save you when it turns bad." "I never needed saving," Clara said. "Just someone who wouldn't leave." They rode off. The dust settled slowly, but the weight lifted fast. Eli turned toward her. His face looked like it hadn't moved at all during the exchange, but his shoulders eased just slightly. "You all right?" he asked. Claire nodded. "Better than I've ever been." He crouched down beside her, his hand on the wheel of her chair, the other brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "He won't be back. That was the last of it." "I know," she said. Because this is home now and I'm not giving that up. Later that week, they planted onions in the garden. The earth was soft from recent rains. Clara worked with sleeves rolled up, sweat at her temples. Eli moved beside her, steady as ever. They spoke little, but they didn't need to. She ran the books for the ranch now, writing, counting, planning what needed trading. Eli handed over every scrap of money to her without question. She kept the numbers tidy. No one had ever trusted her like that. In town, word had spread. Some folks laughed behind their hands. Others watched Eli wearily when he came in for salt or nails. But nobody spoke to his face, and nobody dared ride out to the ranch again. That summer, Clara carved a small wooden sign and nailed it to the front gate. Decker Ranch, not as a name of ownership, but as a name of choice. She wasn't Clara Mercer anymore. She was Clar Decker, and she had chosen that name. In early fall, her hands moved to her stomach while she rested in bed, her palms still. Eli lay beside her, arm draped loosely over her hip. "I think I might be," she whispered. He looked at her. "I'm late and I've been sick twice this week." Eli didn't smile. Not at first, but his eyes filled with something deeper. "You sure?" She nodded slowly. "Not yet, but I think so." He moved closer, kissed her forehead, then her lips. "You're not broken," he said softly. "No," she replied, pressing her hand to his. "I never was." They stayed like that. Two people who weren't looking for miracles, just for a place to stay and someone to stay with, and they found both. The wind moved softly across the hills and the land held them steady. This time, nothing was being taken. This time, they were keeping it. In life, healing often begins not with grand gestures, but with quiet presence, the simple act of staying. Eli and Clara's story reminds us that dignity isn't lost through hardship or broken bodies, but through being unseen. When someone chooses to stay, to listen without judgment, and to offer space instead of pity, it can rekindle a sense of worth that time and cruelty tried to bury. For older hearts especially, this tale reaffirms a timeless truth that it's never too late to rebuild, to be love. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.